The restaurant was almost empty that night, the kind of quiet that made the sound of a fork scraping against a plate echo like thunder. The rain outside had painted the city in silver streaks, and the warm yellow lights inside made everything seem softer, safer, until he noticed her. A woman in a faded blue dress, hair damp from the rain, clutching the small hand of a little girl. She didn't belong there. Not in that fancy restaurant filled with laughter, perfumes, and plates that cost more than a month's groceries. She looked lost, nervous, like someone who had made a mistake and didn't know how to undo it. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet power of human hearts, then please, pause for a second and hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to Single Sun Stories. Let's keep stories like this alive. She had walked in quietly, hoping nobody would notice. Her name was Sarah, and the little girl beside her was Lena, barely 6 years old. Sarah had spent the last of her money on a single meal, one plate of warm food for her daughter. She didn't plan to eat. She hadn't eaten properly in days, but mothers are strange that way. They always fill their hearts before their stomachs. She sat down at the corner table, away from everyone's eyes, pretending to read the menu. Lena, her small hands folded on the table, looked at her mother with a mixture of hunger and worry. She didn't understand why they couldn't just go home and eat. But home wasn't really home anymore. It was a small, cold room in a rundown shelter shared with 2 other families, the kind of place where you learn to be invisible. Sarah had been a teacher once. She loved her job, her students, her life. But things changed quickly. Her husband, Daniel, was kind at first, the kind of man who could make the world feel smaller and safer. Until the layoffs came, until the drinking started, until his anger grew heavier than the love they had. One night, she left with nothing but her daughter and a small suitcase. She thought she'd find a better life. But life, as she soon learned, doesn't always reward courage right away. At the restaurant, she ordered a single kid's meal, a small plate of pasta with cheese and a glass of water. When it arrived, she smiled faintly and told Lena to eat slowly, as if stretching time could stretch food too. She watched her daughter eat, her heart aching at the sight of her joy. She was about to leave quietly after Lena finished, hoping to slip out before anyone noticed they couldn't afford dessert. When she caught a movement from across the room, at one of the tables sat a man in his 40s, eating alone. He was dressed neatly, but there was something distant in his eyes, a kind of quiet that only people who've lost something carry. His name was Michael, though she didn't know it yet. He'd been coming to that restaurant every Thursday for years, always sitting at the same table, always ordering the same meal, roast chicken and mashed potatoes. It was his late wife's favorite. That night, he wasn't really tasting the food. He was just going through the motions, fork, chew, swallow, breathe, until he noticed the little girl. Lena was staring at his plate, not with greed, not with shame, but with a kind of innocent longing, the way a child looks at something she's too polite to ask for. Their eyes met for a second. Michael felt something shift inside him, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. He looked at the woman sitting across from the girl, noticed the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the child's napkin. Something about her reminded him of the nights his own wife, Claire, used to stay up grading papers, tired but full of quiet grace. He hesitated for a moment. People usually do in these moments. The line between helping and intruding is thin. But then he called the waiter and whispered something. A few minutes later, a waiter walked up to Sarah's table carrying 2 steaming plates, one with pasta, one with roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the same dish Michael had been eating. Sarah's eyes widened. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, but the waiter only smiled and nodded toward Michael's table. She turned, unsure what to do, and saw him looking back at her. Not pitying, just kind. She wanted to refuse, but Lena's eyes lit up, and before she could stop her, the little girl whispered, "Mommy, can we say thank you?" Sarah nodded weakly. They both walked over. Michael stood, smiling awkwardly, unsure what to say. He just said, "It's cold outside. You both deserve a warm meal." Sarah tried to thank him, but her voice broke. She'd been strong for so long, pretending she didn't need anyone, pretending she could fix everything. But in that moment, the kindness of a stranger shattered the wall she'd built. They ended up sitting together. The conversation started small. The weather, the city, the little things, but soon it became deeper. Sarah told him bits of her story, skipping the painful parts, but somehow he understood them anyway. Michael told her about his wife, how he'd lost her to cancer 2 years ago, how he'd been living in silence ever since. The rain outside grew heavier, but inside that restaurant, something gentle bloomed. The warmth of 2 broken hearts finding a small piece of healing. By the time they finished dinner, Lena was laughing, telling stories about school, her eyes bright again. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd heard her daughter laugh like that. It felt like the world had paused to let her breathe. When the check came, Michael paid quietly without asking. Sarah protested, but he only smiled and said, "Someday, you'll do this for someone else." That line, simple, sincere, stayed with her long after they parted. Over the next few weeks, they met again, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. Michael would bring small treats for Lena, books, coloring pencils, little things that made her smile. For Sarah, he brought conversation, respect, and something even rarer, a sense of safety. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life. She found a part-time job at a school, then a small apartment. Michael never tried to rescue her. He just walked beside her quietly, patiently. And somehow, that made all the difference. Months passed. One evening, they found themselves walking in the same park where Michael used to walk alone. Lena ran ahead, chasing fireflies, her laughter echoing through the trees. Sarah stood beside him, her heart full but trembling. She whispered, "You could have ignored us that night. You didn't have to help." Michael looked at her, his voice calm. "I didn't do it because I had to. I did it because someone once did the same for me." Sarah never asked who. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that kindness, passed from one broken soul to another, had found its way to her and her little girl. That night, when they parted, Michael looked at Lena and smiled. "You keep smiling like that," he said softly, "and the world will never feel too dark." Years later, Sarah would tell her daughter that story, how a single act of compassion changed everything. She'd tell her that kindness doesn't just fill plates. It fills hearts, it rebuilds lives. And sometimes, when life feels cold and empty, it only takes one stranger to remind us that we're not invisible. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Single Son Stories. It helps us keep sharing stories that remind the world there's still hope, still kindness, still second chances. Special request, in the comments, write "Kindness lives on" to remind someone today that compassion is never wasted.